A caravan laden with some unknown and clearly valuable cargo moves slowly through the dense, gloomy forest. It is accompanied by a close-knit group of guards, consisting mainly of battle-hardened mercenaries. Suddenly, a stranger appears in the caravan's path and demands that all the goods be unloaded from the cart immediately. It turns out that one of the mercenaries has been a spy all along, passing important information to the bandits. However, the remaining mercenaries have no intention of giving up the goods so easily. They're ready to fight to the death. One of the bravest and strongest fighters was named Lois, and he was already ready to deal with these insolent thugs. Another mercenary with blue hair, named Chris, knew Lois was a good fighter, but he thought there was no need to rush. He suggested to the gangsters that they part ways peacefully, without bloodshed or casualties, keeping both sides alive. But the thugs just laughed defiantly in response, completely ignoring Chris's proposal. Realizing that talking was useless, Chris, without hesitation, rushed into battle. Lois, of course, also decides not to stand on the sidelines and joins the fight. The gang leader orders his men to capture all the mercenaries and kill them immediately. Meanwhile, the heroes quickly make a decision to split up and act according to the situation. Chris skillfully uses the traps he set up earlier and quickly takes out some of the gangsters. He was a master at creating traps even from improvised items, such as sharp metal buttons. He also didn't hesitate to use poisonous substances to enhance the effect. Chris used literally everything at his disposal. There were to be no survivors among the enemies. But suddenly, the gang leader himself emerges from the thick bushes, seemingly completely unaffected by the poison. In a rage, he kills Lois and the others, mercilessly dispatching them. This madman was incredibly strong. He drew all his power from a mysterious artifact. Artifacts are magical treasures capable of transforming ordinary objects into weapons or armor, endowing the owner with unreal strength. The situation is hopeless, and it seems Chris's time has come. But he has no intention of just dying. Chris will fight until his last breath. He gritted his teeth. He certainly wasn't going to give up, even if his chances were slim. The thug was terrifyingly strong. His attacks were lightning fast and deadly. With a single sharp movement, he easily chops off Chris's arm in literally a split second. The poor hero didn't stand a chance against this mountain of muscle and malice. But Chris didn't want to die like this, pointlessly and empty-handed. He decides to take the enemy's artifact with him, no matter what. Pushing off the ground with his feet, Chris flies into a deep ravine, dragging the artifact with him. He knew that if he damaged the artifact properly, it would stop working. So Chris swallows it. After all, as he himself said, there's already a bunch of crap inside him. Thus ended the life of 39-year-old Chris, tragically and heroically. But suddenly, a moment later, the hero unexpectedly regains consciousness, and there he discovers, to his surprise, that his right hand is back in place. It seems this is that very strange dream in which, as a 15-year-old teenager, he found himself on the battlefield. In this recurring nightmare, he was always killed by the same fatal blow. He always tried to dodge it, but he never succeeded. But this time, something had changed. He managed to dodge the blow. For the first time ever, Chris successfully dodged, escaping certain death. After that, a strange message popped up before his eyes, stating that he had earned experience points. Pinch himself, he realized. This wasn't a dream. It was all happening in real life. Upon entering the barracks, Chris unexpectedly ran into his childhood friend, Linda. He glanced down and saw a familiar cut on his friend's leg. In his past life, Lind had lost his leg because of this seemingly minor wound. But now, in this new reality, Chris wouldn't let that tragedy happen again. Fortunately, right next to the barracks, he managed to find some rare white grass, but there wasn't enough of it. At that moment, a stern military commander enters the barracks. He announces that, starting today, their teenage unit is becoming a reserve unit of the 7th Infantry Division. From this day forward, they officially begin full-scale combat training, and now their first task is to collect arrows at the site of the recent battle. 10 days pass, and the boys are sent on their first mission along with a group of experienced hunters. Chris decides not to waste any time and gathers necessary and useful resources in the forest. As it happens, a rare and highly valuable honey ant is found nearby. This species is known for its benefits. It will definitely come in handy in the future. And if he manages to get a little honey as well, that would be a real stroke of luck. To find the hive, Chris decides to follow one of the bees. After running a short distance, he finds a small amount of fresh honey. Meanwhile, instead of hunting, his squad is relaxing, carefree, and chatting about all sorts of nonsense. Hunters approach them and ask, have they caught even a single rabbit? And just then, Chris returns from the forest, tired but satisfied. A heavy bag full of caught rabbits hangs on his back. In his home village, Chris was always considered the best hunter, but despite this, the catch still wasn't enough. Chris caught 5 rabbits for each member of the group, but even that wasn't enough to meet the quota. Perhaps if they manage to catch a deer, that will make up for the shortfall. Together with the squad, Chris heads deep into the forest to hunt. They decide to use, and, as if by magic, a deer does indeed appear right in front of them. Chris throws a rock at it, but fails to bring the animal down immediately. However, his throwing skill has improved noticeably. In his past life, with a throw like that, he would have easily taken down the beast, but now he is still too young and inexperienced. He needs to take that into account. The protagonist had anticipated this turn of events, so he had prudently set up an ambush. 2 more guys from his squad were lying in wait in the nearby thick bushes. He had enlisted the help of seasoned professional hunters for this meticulously planned hunt. He needed their physical strength. While Chris's fighters methodically herded the deer into a trap, the hunters would set the snare and use brute force to try to capture the animal. Surprisingly, everything went exactly according to the protagonist's plan. However, the hunters failed. It proved impossible to hold the deer, and it broke free from the trap and bolted. At that very moment, unexpectedly and swiftly, Chris himself bursts out of the bushes with a rock in his hand. With a precise, accurate throw from close range, he managed to hit the target and take the deer down on the spot. The guys from the squad still couldn't believe they were actually eating such luxurious and juicy meat. The main character impressed one of the hunters with his skill, and for that, he was excused from night duty today. The next morning, the military base was in complete disarray. Stray dogs had caused a real mess. They had to be caught as soon as possible, or the soldiers' morale could be seriously shaken. The red-haired hunter immediately realized this matter could not be put off under any circumstances. He immediately entrusted Chris with an important task: to catch these ruthless creatures. Heading into the forest, the hero found a special, rare herb. This herb acted on the dogs like a powerful drug, which was exactly why the animals were behaving so strangely and erratically, placing the herb throughout the base like traps. The dogs, after inhaling it, quickly lost consciousness, as if someone had turned them off. The red-haired hunter once again highlighted Chris's exceptional talent and his unconventional approach. The protagonist became increasingly convinced that this guy was clearly no ordinary private, for red hair symbolizes the special blood of a hunter. And indeed, behind the outward facade of a simple soldier lay a troublemaker and the illegitimate son of the powerful Count van Ludwig, named Gehin Ludwig. In exchange for this sensitive information, Chris agreed to take care of all the remaining stray dogs. Tracking down one of the dogs, they sprang into action, and soon they managed to discover the animal's lair. But that wasn't all. There they also found the scout in hiding. Realizing he had been exposed, the spy bolted and fled. The men immediately gave chase. The scout managed to get a brief lead, but he was mistaken in thinking he was safe. In the end, he walked right into a trap. The enemy was captured, and he was executed without delay, right on the spot. Without further ado, now it was time to deal with the remaining dogs. Some of the animals managed to escape, but their leader was dead, and they would never return here again. However, that was not the end of the story. A white wolf suddenly leaped out of the bushes. A white wolf is an extremely rare creature that lives exclusively on the summit of Mount Sol, and it had no business being here. Nevertheless, the boys managed to deal with this beast without any serious trouble. What's more, they even managed to save the life of its cub, and this wolf cub turned out to be a half-breed. When they returned to base, the guys weren't even allowed to eat properly. Although Chris had caught all the dogs, they weren't even allowed to sniff the prepared food. They had to make a decision: steal something to eat. But suddenly, Chris walked into the room and ordered, "Light a fire!" He had returned from the hunt and brought some meat for his companions. The next day, the main character carefully fed the wolf cub. He even gave the little one a name: Pumpkin. At that moment, a general assembly was announced at the base. During the assembly, one of the commanders called Chris over. It was the centurion himself and the head of the infantry regiment, Commander Canaria. It was he who appointed the main character as the leader of the Decurion, a squad consisting of 10 soldiers. All the guys were completely shocked by such unexpected news, although there were those who didn't exactly welcome the new commander with enthusiasm. And that was understandable. After all, Chris was still just a teenager. Meanwhile, the main character set off with his squad for a marshy area. There, he desperately needed a specific type of grass. The herb was called Dirty Maiden, and it would definitely come in handy for the hero in the future. After that, Chris went to the commander of the infantry regiment to report on the results of the reconnaissance, but the guards at the entrance just laughed mockingly in his face. The young man didn't mess around with them and immediately made it clear who was standing before them. One of the Decurion commanders, named Padel, stepped in to resolve the conflict. He told Chris that his group was showing the best results among all the reconnaissance units. The protagonist also asked what the commander of the infantry regiment actually did. Padel explained that the man had previously served as a knight under Baron Ronald, but because of an affair with the Baron's wife, he had been demoted, and now, overcome with despair, often turned to the bottle. And then it dawned on Chris. He remembered why the infantry regiment had been wiped out in his past life. The commander, driven to despair, had simply abandoned his men to their fate. This cannot be allowed to happen. Something must be done immediately, or history will repeat itself. According to the protagonist's precise calculations, this very spot is the strategic point between the 8th gate and his military headquarters. And there they are, those very gates. A plan has finally taken shape in Chris's mind, but to carry it out, he first needs to return to base and bring the skins of the defeated dogs with him. When he arrived back at camp, he wasted no time and immediately set to work. Chris began crafting spears using daggers, as well as making shields from the sturdy hides of the slain dogs. And from that very day on, a new chapter began. The protagonist starts personally training his own squad. Now they would prepare for the coming fierce battle, which could prove decisive. However, there was one last and serious problem remaining. Commander Canary. He was the main thorn in the side and the obstacle to the entire infantry regiment's success. If he were removed, it's quite likely that a new commander would be put in his place, perhaps Padel. But Canary had his own people, and their numbers were cause for concern. If he were simply killed, Chris would also be doomed to certain death. However, there is still one unconventional path left, a way to save the regiment without bloodshed. Chris urgently gathers his entire squad. As they are about to undertake a dangerous mission, they secretly made their way into enemy territory, where any mistake could cost them their lives. So they had to be as careful as possible. Along the way, they found a rare fruit called Hyoda's Sorrow. Although it is considered poisonous, if eaten together with a certain white herb, your eyes gain the temporary ability to see in complete darkness. This unique effect lasts exactly 24 hours, so there's no time to waste. Using their new ability, they quickly spotted 5 enemy soldiers. Even for fighters as strong as Digo and Daki, this would be a serious challenge. They need to lure them into a dark area where Chris's squad will have the advantage, night vision. So Chris, having taken off his military uniform, dared to approach the enemies with his face uncovered. He grabbed some food from the enemy's table and sprinted away, acting as bait. 2 enemy warriors took the bait and rushed after him, moving further and further away from the camp. At that moment, the rest of Chris's squad launched an ambush, emerging from the bushes. Meanwhile, the rest of the squad attacked those who had remained in the camp. By dividing the enemy, they gained the upper hand and accomplished their mission. Having donned the armor of their defeated enemies, the next morning, they took delivery of the supplies without arousing suspicion. By this point, the enemies had already found traces of blood and signs of a struggle. They quickly realized they had lost 5 of their soldiers. Meanwhile, real trouble was brewing at the infantry regiment's camp. Supplies were rapidly running out. Due to Kinnery's negligence, the Count had completely turned his back on this regiment. But to everyone's surprise, a wagon pulled up to the camp. Inside were Chris and his entire reconnaissance squad, returning from their mission. Thanks to the protagonist's well-thought-out plan, they managed to steal entire wagons of provisions from the 8th gate. He was only 15 years old, but he had already defeated the enemies and returned with trophies. The next day, Commander Kinnery began official training for all the regiment's soldiers. The start of the training was simple, but grueling. Everyone began with an exhausting run. It seems Chris managed to inspire Canary after all. His tactical plan worked. During the training session at lunchtime, the commander personally demonstrated his combat skills. Separate training sessions were also held for the archers. Preparations were in full swing. Group exercises are set to begin in 2 days. The squad must be prepared for battle. In addition, the regiment would have to attack several more key supply points of the 8th gate. To do this, it is first necessary to form a strike group, and only then to deploy the main forces. The very next day, this strike force was fully assembled, but several enemy scouts had already spotted its movement. Under no circumstances can they be allowed to return to their own lines and report this. These scouts must be eliminated immediately. So Chris's squad set up a clever ambush. The surviving enemies began to retreat hastily, splitting up and scattering in different directions. But Lin had already taken aim and fired an arrow accurately at one of them. Dean was already catching up to the second scout. It was decided to spare one of the enemy scouts. His task was to reveal all the information about the latest changes in the escort forces. Now everything was ready. All that remained was to send a signal to the main unit. The time had come. After that, Chris and his squad headed straight for the enemy base, disguised as allies. Under the pretext of a new decree, the protagonist politely requested an inspection of all transported supplies. Thanks to this move, he obtained all the vital data he needed. Throwing a dagger into the air, he gave the secret signal to begin the mission. The strike force is already in position. The operation begins. The enemies were not prepared for such a swift and daring attack. Spies from Chris's unit also sprang into action and attacked from the inside. The enemies didn't stand a chance. They were caught off guard. Victory was practically in Chris and his fighters' hands. All that remained was to eliminate their commander. With a lightning-fast move, the protagonist hurled his dagger straight at the enemy commander, hitting the mark. From that moment on, victory officially went to the infantry regiment under Kinnery's command. All these battles were not in vain. Chris's skills had noticeably improved. Now his squad was completely different, mature and powerful. And all this without having to kill Kinnery. However, there is one mystery Chris still cannot fathom. Why is a nobleman named Guillen hiding under the guise of a common soldier? Moreover, the protagonist is growing increasingly eager to test his own strength in battle. Without hesitation, he challenges Guillen to a duel. And so, the battle began. The red-haired hunter seems to have underestimated Chris. He faced him unarmed, but even without a sword, he radiated a sinister energy and a powerful presence. It is quite possible that Guillen is a vice, one who has reached the final stage of a warrior, having completely renounced his humanity. In his past life, Chris hadn't even had a chance to face such a force, which meant he had to give it his all now. The closer he got to his opponent, the harder it was to breathe. The pressure intensified with every step, and suddenly, a single lightning-fast swing of Guillen's sword, and Chris found himself cut to pieces. But the next second he came to, all the pain, all the cuts, it was just an illusion. He wasn't hurt. It was all a hallucination, induced solely by his opponent's aura. Just how incredibly strong this guy was. Simply standing next to him, Chris could feel an overwhelming sense of tension. After such an ordeal, he could use a couple of days off. The next day, while patrolling the borders, 2 soldiers from the unit were carrying out their usual guard duty. But suddenly, out of nowhere, unknown figures in cloaks appeared and silently knocked out both guards. They infected them with a new curse of the 8 gates, a virus called the White Demon. At that moment, the main character was peacefully petting his pet, Pumpkin. Suddenly, the men returned to camp with alarming news, an attack on the 2 guards. Chris senses that something is clearly wrong here. In his past life, the curse of the 8 gates never reached his squad, but now, everything is different. He must figure out what is happening. The White Demon is a terrible disease that covers the body in frost, after which the person dies. Hundreds of healers and doctors have died trying to find a cure for this curse. Eventually, a solution was found. The key ingredient in the antidote was contained in the Dirty Maiden plant, which Chris had recently gathered. To make the medicine, this plant had to be boiled in water. Then, bluegrass leaves had to be added to the resulting decoction to enhance the effect. One of the soldiers was already feeling ill. The disease had begun to take effect. The first symptoms were obvious: blackened teeth and a strange hallucination of a blue sky. From these signs, the others realized too, this was indeed the White Demon. One of the soldiers, Dingo, gave in to panic and declared that they must immediately burn all the infected. He was certain, if they were left alive, the entire company would be doomed. And if Chris tried to stop him, he'd take him out too. Dingo had lost his mind. He had to be stopped immediately. The squad rushed at him in full force. They managed to subdue their crazed comrade. Commander Kinnery entered the tent. Through tears and gasps for breath, Dingo begged Kinnery to burn all the infected. It turned out he hadn't lost his mind for no reason. He was from Trezidi. It's a small town in Circa that was completely destroyed by that very disease. Dingo is the only one who survived that tragedy. He lost everything: family, friends, home. It seems Canary is beginning to lean toward his point of view. Chris now needs to prove that his antidote works, at any cost. He decides to press Canary on his personal past. Chris makes a promise. If the commander believes him, he'll restore his knighthood. The next day, a miracle happened. All the sick began to recover. They even built a full-fledged infirmary, where they now sent the infected from other units. 3 days later, all the patients were completely cured. This diverted attention and suspicion away from the 8 gates. concealing their involvement in spreading the curse. Chris's soldiers burned the wagon to create the appearance of cremating the infected, all to deceive the enemy. Seeing the black smoke, the enemies concluded that the unit had been weakened and immediately launched an attack. However, this turned out to be yet another trap planned by Chris. The squad's archers took up positions and opened a barrage of fire. As a result of the sudden volley, most of the enemies were eliminated. The surviving enemies were surrounded. They had been lured into a tactical cauldron. They found themselves completely surrounded. But despite the hopeless situation, the enemies had no intention of surrendering without a fight. Their strength proved to be greater than Chris had expected. They fought back fiercely and inflicted serious damage. But Chris's goal isn't victory at any cost, but to force the enemy to retreat. The key task now is to take out their commander. Without a leader, the enemy ranks would fall into confusion. Commander Canary also had no intention of standing on the sidelines. He personally joins the battle. But there is something strange about the enemy's behavior. They are not attacking, but merely defending themselves. It turns out they were stalling for time, waiting for reinforcements. And then, a terrifying monster appears on the battlefield, slicing a soldier in half with a single blow. Now the enemy army has gone on the offensive. The monster approaches Chris. The protagonist feels the same suffocating pressure as in the battle with Jalen. No doubt about it, this opponent is on the level of a knight. The brute takes an interest in Chris, so young and already a commander. He wants to see what this kid is capable of. Chris really proves himself. For his age, he's incredibly strong. He manages to parry the monster's blows, but the fight is interrupted by an unexpected intervention. It's Lind. He's come to the rescue. Dingo joins them as well. Now, it's 2 against 1. But the monster just scoffs. Do these kids really think they can defeat him? He delivers a lightning-fast strike, but Dingo manages to block it. The monster has grown stronger. It's become even more dangerous. While Dingo distracts and holds him off, Chris attacks from the flank and pierces him with his spear. The Wolf Knight is furious. How dare these puppies stand up to him? Dingo is on the brink. His strength is running out. But Chris finds an opening to land a precise blow to the enemy's head. He damages the monster's eye. However, he pays a price for it. His arm snaps. Is this really the end? Suddenly, a notification appears in front of Chris. He has received an artifact. A broken arm heals instantly. He feels lightness in his body, as if he's become weightless. It doesn't matter what happened. The main thing now is to win. With a sharp lunge, Chris plunges the dagger into his enemy's shoulder and finally defeats him. How did he manage to defeat a real knight? Meanwhile, the 5th Infantry has arrived to help. They are led by Captain Madri. In his past life, Chris hid behind those who had talents, using them as a shield. Now things are different. He goes into battle himself and takes responsibility. After the battle, Chris and Canary head toward the 3rd Ode. The Odes are the army's greatest commanders. One of them is Vihane Ludwig, the eldest son of Baron van Ludwig. He is genuinely surprised. The victory over the knight was won by nothing more than a boy. He also publicly acknowledges the merits of the entire infantry regiment. As a reward, Canary is appointed commander of a unit of 500 soldiers, and Chris receives his first official rank, commander of a unit of 100 soldiers. After Ludwig personally pinned the epaulets on the protagonist with his own hands, the atmosphere became more solemn and tense. Without delay, the hero told him everything he knew about the mysterious, special fighters of a secret unit called the 8 Gates. According to him, there is a high probability that the enemies intend to use this hidden unit to treacherously assassinate Ludwig Vihane. But Chris, despite this, had already anticipated everything. He had a clear plan for how to end this protracted war in just 2 days. The essence of the plan lies in launching a swift and sudden attack on the 8 Gates unit's most critical transport routes. To carry out the plan, it was necessary to urgently assemble 100 of the best fighters and form them into a special elite combat unit. It took only a few days, and the unit was already fully staffed, organized, and ready to begin the active phase of the offensive. The unexpected, sudden attack on the enemy proved extremely effective and worked exactly as intended. The soldiers of the 8 Gates did not expect such an attack at all, and were therefore quickly and mercilessly destroyed without putting up any meaningful resistance. However, the main objective of this operation was not simply the destruction of enemy soldiers. The real task was the complete elimination of all their supplies of food, weapons, and horses. While the fighting raged on the front lines, Chris was at the base, trying to figure out a mysterious, strange artifact. Apparently, on the day he fought the Wolf Knight, his skills had reached a critical point, and his body suddenly began to change. In his past life, his loyal friend Lois once demonstrated an incredible, almost impossible trick. With a single sharp swing of his sword, Lois sliced a wooden beam into many small pieces. In that life, Chris wouldn't have dared to even dream of repeating such a feat. Back then, it seemed beyond the realm of possibility. But now, in this new life, he felt the power. He was truly capable of it. Having finished his personal training, the protagonist set about training his subordinate fighters as well. The training focused on developing skills in teamwork, coordination, and tactics. Besides, a crucial battle was soon to take place, in which Chris would need to show his strongest side. The next morning, all the armies were assembled and stood facing each other, waiting for the signal. And then, the commander's orders rang out. Attack, forward, spare no enemy. A veritable bloodbath began. Blood spilled everywhere, and screams and moans filled the air. Soldiers on both sides mercilessly hacked at each other and pierced bodies with long spears. When new soldiers appeared on the battlefield, the atmosphere instantly changed. Meanwhile, Chris didn't waste a second. He was preparing his squad for the decisive assault. Circa's warriors were clearly losing the battle. They began to lose ground. The difference in strength between the Eight Gates fighters and Cirque's army was obvious, even to the untrained eye. And suddenly, Chris's squad appeared on the battlefield. The very warriors he had personally trained. They were the elite. One couldn't take them lightly. Maximum caution was required. But Chris's soldiers turned out to be no pushovers either. They were true fighters, battle-hardened. With his powerful and timely arrival, Chris managed to radically change the entire course of the bloody battle. However, the enemies had no intention of giving up. They were still striving to break through. Nevertheless, the Eight Gates fighters began to fall one after another, rapidly losing strength. It was now perfectly clear they had lost this battle once and for all. The remaining enemy soldiers began to retreat in panic, losing their formation. It was an unqualified victory. Throughout this bloody battle, Chris saw every single movement of the enemies, as if in slow motion. In his past life, he couldn't even have imagined such a thing in his wildest dreams. In this reality, Chris is not a coward hiding behind others' backs, but a true leader and warrior leading the army into battle. Of the entire Eight Gate squad, only 12 managed to survive and escape. The rest fell. And all of this happened thanks to him, a young soldier with bright blue hair who turned the tide of history. Meanwhile, exhausted, Chris loses consciousness from exhaustion and wakes up safe and sound at the base. There he is met by his loyal and caring Pumpkin, who hasn't left her master's side for a moment. Later, he returns to the recently recaptured territory to restore order. And there, right in front of him, the Count himself appears, the esteemed Van Ludwig. The Count personally awards all the fighters from Chris's squad with silver coins, 5 each, and Commander Canary is officially awarded the honorary title of Knight for his displayed courage. However, Canary declines the title, expressing a desire to receive a reward in the form of gold coins instead. Next, Chris himself takes the stage. His appearance is met with thunderous applause. The soldiers cheer enthusiastically, calling him St. Chris for his valor. As a reward for all his achievements, Chris receives an order, a symbol of honor and courage. But even this proves insufficient for him. He feels he deserves more. Chris wants one thing: to become a true, full-fledged knight. Everyone present was literally stunned by such audacity and courage on the part of a mere boy. However, the Count himself treated the protagonist's actions with respect. He fully appreciated his courage. It was at that very moment that Chris was officially appointed a squire under the personal patronage of the Count himself. Later that evening, in the warm atmosphere of the barracks, Chris decided to ask Canary why he had refused the honorable title of knight. But Canary clearly didn't want to talk about it and evaded the question, leaving the hero puzzled. The next morning, Chris was given his own private room right in the barracks. He also received an important assignment. He had to go on a mission. He headed to the herb and potion shop run by an old apothecary. There, Chris needed a rather unusual herb with a mysterious name, White Finger. It would be another 15 long years before this herb was officially recognized as the key ingredient for unlocking hidden abilities. But for now, it was just a little-known herb that hardly anyone was interested in. Nevertheless, having struck a good deal, Chris agreed to buy it every month for 5 copper coins. On his way back to the barracks, he unexpectedly ran into an acquaintance, the cheerful and boisterous Dingo. Dingo, unable to hide his curiosity, asked Chris, what exactly is he trying to achieve? Were his ambitions really so great that he wanted to become a true aristocrat? But Chris's goal was far loftier and grander than just a rank or a title. Inspired, Dingo swore that from now on he would follow Chris until the very end of his life. The protagonist accepted his vow with respect and recognized him as a true ally. Later, he visited the herb storage room located in the new barracks. Now he wouldn't have to gather them by hand anymore. Suddenly, the commander of the entire military camp, the stern and straightforward Strike, unexpectedly walked into the warehouse. He had a serious conversation with our hero without any unnecessary pleasantries. He made it clear right away he wasn't going to mince words, but would speak plainly and without embellishment. Chris could leave the camp at any moment to find a knight mentor and follow him. But if he decides to stay, he'll have to prove that he's worth something and worthy of trust. Chris proposes. If he is given a squad of 100 fighters at his disposal, he will prove his worth. However, the commander responds harshly. He won't entrust his soldiers to some 15-year-old teenager. To earn the right to command, Chris will have to prove his strength in battle, one-on-one. Understanding the terms, Chris himself asks to be given 3 opponents, and he will fight them all alone. This behavior is surprising. What does this kid think he's doing? Does he think he can handle 3 at once? Chris isn't worried about the fight itself. He's more concerned about the state of his skill points. And now the moment of truth has arrived. The official duel begins. Paitler is the first opponent. Though he hasn't participated in real battles, he has won 10 duels in a row without a single loss. Victory is awarded to whoever either disarms their opponent or forces them to surrender voluntarily. Paitler decides to attack first. He advances with a determined thrust, but Chris easily dodges the first blow, as if he had anticipated it in advance. Next, Paitler lands a second strike, and once again, Chris successfully blocks the attack. With a deft, precise movement, he throws his opponent off balance, disarms him, and ends the fight. That concludes the battle. The victory is undoubtedly Chris's. Now he gains access to the entire stockpile of rare medicines and potions. Returning to the barracks, the hero decides to rest and take a relaxing bath. He adds white finger to the water, along with other herbs he took from the storeroom. This mixture purifies the water and transforms it into a substance capable of altering the body and opening the path to inner energy. However, this entire process requires time and patience. It will last a whole year without interruption. Chris realizes that he is still too weak. He urgently needs to improve his skills and abilities. In his past life, he had a mentor named Tekil, a wise and powerful warrior. Now Chris is searching for him again, but for a whole month he hasn't been able to find a single trace of him. And then a memory comes to mind. Tekil had a daughter who might hold the key. He has a few possible guesses as to who exactly might be his mentor's daughter. One of the possibilities turned out to be Ellis, a girl who works at a local tavern and has caught Chris's attention. Suddenly, as if by fate, none other than Tekil himself walks into the tavern, that very mentor from the past. At the same time, a rude and drunk soldier, clearly unaware of the limits of what is acceptable, began to harass Ellis. Without wasting a second, Tekil silently and coolly stepped right up to the troublemaker. With one swift movement, he grabbed the insolent man by the head and literally slammed his face into the wooden floor. After that, he declared that this man would no longer be able to open his mouth and insult others. It was now clear Ellis was indeed the daughter of the legendary mentor. After the incident, Tekil calmly turned around and left the tavern in silence, without saying another word. Chris, without hesitation, decided to stay there for the night. Perhaps he'd get a chance to talk to Tekil. The next morning, Tekil was back at the tavern. He was sitting at a table, lost in thought. Chris decided not to miss the moment and offered the man some company over a cup of freshly brewed tea. He introduced himself as a knight in training and expressed his respect for the legendary warrior. The hero bluntly stated that he wanted Tekil to teach him the art of wielding various weapons. Tekil agreed, but immediately warned him he had no experience teaching others. Then Chris suggested they have a duel so Tekil could personally assess his potential. Without further ado, they began fighting right there. The duel began. Without a moment's hesitation, Tekil immediately went on the offensive against his young opponent. Chris managed to react and blocked the first strike, though with difficulty. However, he was knocked back several meters. The force of the blow was immense. Is that all this guy has to offer? Just his excessive self-confidence? Tekil doesn't stop and continues his attack with growing fury. He uses his signature technique, a simultaneous attack with 3 sticks. Chris recognizes this move. After all, it was Tekil who taught it to him in his past life, so he easily copies the movement and counters with the same move. This surprises Tequila. He clearly didn't expect to see such skill from a teenager. Yes, Chris is definitely good, especially considering his age and limited experience. However, he still lacks real strength and stamina. Later, Tequil returns to the tavern and confesses to Ellis that he is her biological father. He abandoned her and her mother and was on the run for 20 long years. He never wanted things to turn out this way, but that's how it happened. He deeply regrets it. Ellis asks him to teach her how to use a sword. She has long dreamed of this. Ever since she was a child, she's wanted to become a real knight and protect the weak. Tequil couldn't refuse his daughter and agreed to train her as well. Now Chris and Ellis will undergo rigorous training together, like true partners. Their sessions began with something simple but exhausting, a morning run. Immediately after that, they moved on to practicing fighting stances and maintaining balance. Then came pull-ups, strength exercises with no breaks. In his past life, Tequila's training hadn't been nearly as brutal or exhausting. After each grueling day, Chris would always take a bath in water purified with white finger. 3 days later, the hero had fully recovered his strength and arrived at the next training session in excellent shape. He had become noticeably faster and more resilient. The progress was obvious even to those around him. In addition, he had acquired another special artifact, a source of strength and potential. He could have used the company of Dingo, Daki, and Linda during training, but they serve under Strike's command. One day, Ling told Chris that the camp commander was summoning him urgently. When he arrived at Strike's office, Strike demanded that he immediately stop using the medicine storage. It turned out that due to a shortage of herbs, his wife had caused a scene, and now he was out of favor. Chris sincerely apologized to Strike, realizing his mistake. Then he seized the moment and offered to take charge of the warehouse, but on the condition that he be assigned 3 assistants. The offer proved convincing. At the next training session, Chris's friends were already with him. Now all that remained was to sort out the situation at the medicine warehouse. To do this, he decided to turn to the city's Shadow, a secretive and dangerous gang. But they refused to say where their leader was. They were hiding his whereabouts, so he had to resort to his fists and apply a little physical pressure. Chris didn't plan to hit hard, but it turned out that with a single blow, he knocked out his opponent. That's how he found out where the Shadow's base was and who was in charge. However, neither the leader nor his subordinates were happy about a visit from some cocky schoolboy. Well, if you want a fight, you'll get one. No questions asked. With a single precise move, Chris takes out 2 opponents at once, before they even have a chance to react. He landed just 1 blow on each of them, and that was enough to win. The leader was outraged. If his whole gang couldn't handle the kid, he'd take care of it himself. But Chris knocks him away with a powerful kick, as if he were a toy, and immediately follows a second blow, several times stronger than the previous one. After the leader came to his senses, Chris calmly approached him with one small but important request. He asked him to gather as many useful herbs as possible, needed to restock the medicine supply. Now the problem with the medicine is finally solved. Everything is under the protagonist's control. Meanwhile, his friends were thoroughly exhausted from training. They were in far from the best shape. To help them recover, Chris let them take special baths with purified and energized water. In the evening, having finished all his tasks, he was resting peacefully in his tent, immersed in silence. Suddenly, the air began to fill with a strange smoke of unknown and alarming origin. The smell of this smoke resembled a mixture of a sleeping potion and the poisonous herb Marin Blue, a dangerous combination. Fortunately, there was an antidote nearby, which he quickly took, then began to look around carefully. He saw 2 robbers trying to calm down the frightened and snarling pumpkin. As soon as one of them spotted Chris, he immediately hurled a sharp dagger at him. The hero deftly dodged the flying blade. His reflexes kicked in instantly. Without waiting for a second attack, he instantly lunged at his opponents. With a powerful and precise blow, he sent one of the bandits flying far backward. Judging by the dull crack, the blow had likely broken several of his ribs. Realizing who they were dealing with, the robbers didn't take any chances and hastily retreated. But that was a mistake. Tchaikovka had already memorized their scent and picked up the trail. Following the beast, Chris had no trouble finding their secret hideout. He gave them an ultimatum. If they wanted to live, they had to bring their real boss out right now. And as if on cue, their commander had already emerged from hiding. He was right there. Chris had only one question. Why had he been the target of the attack? The gang leader admitted that it was all because of the pure sleep formula that Chris was preparing. As he spoke, Chris sensed that he was being surrounded from all sides. He tossed a handful of coins toward the ringleader and demanded to meet the gang's real boss. Such audacity and a provocative tone of voice infuriated the leader. Everything is decided by a fight. They agreed to a duel right here and now. In the blink of an eye, a deadly dagger flew toward Chris's face, but he managed to intercept it mid-flight. The movement was precise and swift. He flung the weapon back, and it plunged right into his opponent's leg. The wound was serious. The leader fell, clutching his thigh and grinding his teeth. After that, the rest of the gang rushed at Chris in a rage. But at that moment, they were stopped by a third person, unknown but imposing. It turned out to be that very hunter with fiery red hair, Gian, well known in these parts. He didn't stand on ceremony and declared Chris the new leader of the Backdager gang, and a cocky guy named Fox is now appointed as his deputy. It was clear from his face that he certainly wasn't beaming with joy. The next day, Chris, as always, arrived at practice on time. Tekel asked him an important question, testing his level of thinking and preparation. "What will you do if you lose your weapon during a fight?" the mentor asked. The hero replied without hesitation, "I'll turn my own body into a weapon." Tekel was pleased and announced that taijutsu training would now begin. After a grueling training session, Chris returned to his tent when an unfamiliar young man entered. He introduced himself as a knight in training named McCoy and said that someone important was summoning Chris. McCoy accompanied him to a building where representatives of the nobility were already waiting. Waiting for him, there was none other than the Count's son, Wilhelm Ludwig, a very influential figure. He offered Chris a position in his service, promising full support in return. If the hero agreed, he would receive the title of knight, or even a peerage. Anything was possible. But Chris refused. He had no intention of serving anyone else's interests, even if they were noble. He thanked him for the food and hospitality, and then politely but firmly left the building. This audacious insolence seriously angered the aristocrat. He wasn't used to such treatment. The next day, Chris received a new assignment directly from his boss. In 2 days, he would have to set out for a town called Highgard. He had only 2 days to prepare. Time was tight, and the stakes were high. Most likely, Wilhelm Ludwig hadn't forgotten the insult and had deliberately entrusted him with a dangerous mission. Upon arriving at the Backdager base, Chris ordered Fox to disband the squad and send people to Highgard to gather intelligence. The whole situation looked suspicious. It's as if everything has been set up to frame Chris. On top of that, he ordered Fox to bring some traps and coils of barbed wire. Later, Chris stopped by to see Tequila. He needed some advice before the mission. He asked, what should he do if the enemy turns out to be much stronger than him? His mentor's answer was short and to the point: run for your life. But what if he couldn't get away? Maybe there was a secret technique or trick. Well, actually, there is. It's relentless training and constant conditioning every day. But seriously, Tekel can teach you some genuinely useful combat techniques. By evening, the scouts had returned from Highgard. 5 elite fighters had recently gone there. Well, the time had come. Chris set off on a long journey with his squad. On the way, they stumbled upon a pack of aggressive goblins. Basically, they weren't a threat. The squad dealt with them pretty quickly. But why were there so many goblins? And what were they even doing in these parts? They had to make a short stop to rest and scout the area. The protagonist personally set traps to reinforce the camp's security. As evening fell, they continued on their way. Time was running short. However, they ran into another group of goblins right on the road. If this kept up, they definitely wouldn't make it to Haggard before nightfall. So they had to set up camp again and stay the night. Early the next morning, they pressed on without slowing down. After several hours of travel, they finally reached their destination. And there he was, the one for whom all this had been undertaken, the prince. He was the 3rd prince of the royal dynasty, Edik Cercado Gavshosh. Chris was entrusted with a crucial task: to escort the prince to the city of Dibend. They set off, the escort squad and the prince himself leading the way. But suddenly, bandits emerged from the thickets and attacked them. The attack was unexpected and began in a flash. The enemies surrounded the entire group. There was no way to retreat. A fierce battle for the prince's life and safety began. Chris had anticipated an ambush, but hadn't expected so many enemies. He needed to break through as quickly as possible and continue protecting his target. Using a new technique Tekel had taught him, he quickly neutralized several enemies. But the most important thing was to protect the prince, no matter the cost. Damn it! The prince has been captured and is being held hostage. Chris took aim, tensed his whole body, and hurled the spear with tremendous force. The sharp spear pierced the attacker holding the prince, and then, using another technique from his new arsenal, he finished off the enemy instantly. Realizing that staying here was too dangerous, the protagonist decided to retreat. He decided to escape and single-handedly deliver the little prince safe and sound to Dibend. The bandits, not to be outdone, rushed after the fleeing Chris. However, they quickly fell into the traps the hero had prudently set in advance. Unfortunately, this proved insufficient. The surviving enemies continued their pursuit. It was at that very moment that Pumpkin stood before them, fierce and fearless. A fiery whirlwind burst from her wide maw, scorching everything in its path. What kind of creature is this? And how did it become Chris's ally? Thanks to Pumpkinhead's intervention, Chris and the prince managed to escape their pursuers. But that was only at first glance. The two thugs had found their hiding place after all. Pumpkin managed to take down only one opponent. The second and third remained at large. Chris took off all his heavy armor to increase his mobility. He wanted to give his opponents at least a tiny glimmer of hope for success. But literally a single precise and powerful blow proved more than enough. The thugs immediately began to retreat. The fear in their eyes was real. How does this guy, exhausted and holding a child in his arms, retain such monstrous strength? One thing is clear. These enemies are no match for him and never will be. Chris had already become a true beast in battle. Dangerous, unstoppable, almost supernatural. He would have gladly captured the gangsters for interrogation, but leaving the prince alone was too risky. At the same time, one of the bandits returned to his mysterious master. It turned out to be Rados Ben, one of the Duke's own warriors. Since his men had failed, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Meanwhile, Chris and the prince decided to take shelter in the forest for the night. During their conversation, the hero suggested that Vian Ludwig might be behind the attack. The little prince promised that as soon as they reached daybed, he would deal with him personally. But before going to sleep, they needed to eat a little and regain their strength. And here came Taikovka back. She really deserved praise today. That night, Chris sensed someone's sinister presence. Danger was very close by. The only weapon he had left was a short sword. Not the best option for defense. There was only one attacker, but he exuded a terrifying power. The enemy delivered a lightning-fast and devastating blow, leaving no time to react. The protagonist couldn't dodge in time. It all happened too fast. But just then, Jilin emerged from the darkness and blocked the blow, saving Chris. Now everything became clear. It was no wonder Chris had sensed something familiar about him. This opponent and Jilin, they were alike, as if from the same school. The fight began, fast, brutal, almost invisible to the naked eye. Each of their strikes was like a flash of lightning, power and speed beyond the norm. No one around could make out their movements. The fight was lightning fast. Even Chris could barely keep up with the fight. It was that intense. At first, it seemed that they were evenly matched, but gradually, Jilin began to lose ground. The red-haired hunter was outmatched by the stranger in speed and reaction time, but he clearly surpassed his enemy in sheer physical strength. With a powerful downward strike, he put all his strength into one final thrust. The opponent's sword shattered into pieces, as if it were made of glass. Even the mask on the enemy's face couldn't withstand such an attack. It cracked in half. Without a weapon, the enemy could no longer continue the fight and hastily retreated. Thanks to their efforts, the prince survived and was safely delivered to daybed. The next morning, Chris woke up to the sound of Miko calling out to him. Stepping outside, he was immediately handcuffed, an arrest by official order. The order had been signed by Count Ludwig himself, and that left no room for doubt. Chris was accused of attempting to assassinate the third prince of Circa. He had only suspected the Count's involvement, but now everything was crystal clear. Without further ado, the hero was taken to the building where the trial was to take place. The Count himself was already in the courtroom, watching the proceedings. Vian Ludwig took the floor. He began to publicly accuse Chris. He claimed that Chris had been working with the gangsters and that everything had been planned in advance. Allegedly, the hero wanted to save the prince solely to boost his status and advance his career. Most likely, the truth no longer mattered. Everything had been rigged in advance. But suddenly, the third prince himself entered the hall, Edik Cercado Gavsh in the flesh. He, too, wanted to be present for the verdict and sort things out himself. Taking his seat, the prince didn't beat around the bush. He immediately declared, "Chris is innocent." Vikin Ludwig was extremely and intensely displeased. He was clearly unhappy, but despite his personal opinion, the Count still had to support the prince's decision without hesitation. Immediately after the trial ended, Chris and the prince headed to a cozy local tavern. It seems this young hero made a very strong impression on the prince, who invited Chris to accompany him to the capital itself. However, if our hero were to go there right now, any chance of achieving recognition and glory in military service would simply vanish. So Chris asked the prince for a favor, to give him exactly 3 years, during which time he would capture the first stronghold of the 8th Gate. Fortunately, the prince agreed to this proposal, and all the difficult circumstances were ultimately resolved successfully. But despite this, Chris's new problems only multiplied. They literally came crashing down one after another. If Gillen hadn't shown up at that very moment, our hero would most likely have already perished. Realizing this, Chris understood. He urgently needed to become even stronger, faster, and more resilient. However, for now, he decided to take a short break, relax, and head into the tavern with his loyal friends. That evening, Ellie confessed that she had already decided on a weapon. She wanted to get herself an elegant rapier. To this, Daki skeptically remarked that a rapier was too heavy for a girl and would hardly suit her. Ellie was convinced otherwise, and, with a smirk, challenged him to a contest to see who could drink more. In the end, Ellie turned out to be the unexpected winner of the contest. 3 months of intense and grueling training had passed, and finally, Chris began to feel mana in his body. He had finally succeeded. Now he could begin studying the vase and become much stronger. But to fully master vase, simply feeling mana isn't enough. A special method called the Tower of Nine is required. To master this complex method, Chris found the right expert, a man with deep knowledge. That person turned out to be Sick Million, a scholar from Central Shed who studies all vase practices. Since it was the prince himself who had sent this man, the chief immediately granted Chris his well-deserved leave. The simple ability to sense mana is only the first step on the long path to mastering the art of vase. To fully master vase, one must go through 2 main stages. The first is the seal, and the second is the opening. For the seal, one must use the mana energy surrounding the body to draw a closed magical circle. After successfully drawing it, a mark reflecting the vase training method appears on a part of the body. After 3 weeks of intense training, Chris managed with great difficulty to draw the magic circle. The next stage is applying the seal. Whichever symbol appears, that is the path of development the vase must follow. However, Chris had a much bolder plan, to try combining 2 different symbols at once. But just then, one of the soldiers came running up to him in a hurry and in a panic, looking extremely agitated. The soldier delivered urgent news. All troops must be assembled immediately, for war had broken out with the 8 gates. Chris, of course, had expected an invasion, but he never imagined it would begin so soon. During the unexpected invasion, 3 reconnaissance units of 100 men each were completely destroyed by the 8 gates. The Triangle Zone, under the control of Count Ludwig, remained unshaken. Unlike other weaker lands, the 8 gates troops received orders to burn absolutely every village outside the Triangle territory to the ground. Meanwhile, Circa's army had already been mobilized and was fully prepared for combat. The Count personally stepped onto the stage in front of all the assembled soldiers to address them directly. Without further ado, he said just one thing: the enemy must be wiped out without mercy. With the help of the cunning fox, the protagonist managed to discover the exact location of the enemy's main forces. Upon receiving this information, Chris immediately went to Count Ludwig with a decisive and very important request. He wanted exactly 100 cavalrymen. Then he would be able to destroy the enemies who had killed the scouts. The Count admired the hero's determination and courage, but he warned him, if Chris failed, he would lose his head. Chris was ready to go all the way. He would achieve victory no matter the cost. Together with the combat unit, our hero set out on a mission full of danger and uncertainty. Thanks to Lind and his superb eyesight, which did not fail him, they managed to spot the enemy's movements. He saw them. Standing before them were about 200 well-armed opponents. By that point, Chris's mastery of Vice had reached level 21, a significant achievement. With the new level, something inside him changed. The next stage of learning, called Discovery, had begun. At the same time, Tykopka managed to infiltrate the enemy base, unnoticed by anyone. Using fire and her agility, she scattered all the enemy horses, causing indescribable chaos in the camp. Meanwhile, the detachment led by our main character unexpectedly stumbled upon enemy forces. As a result of a fierce and swift skirmish, the enemy detachment, numbering about 20 fighters, was completely destroyed. All that endless, grueling training had not been in vain. Now the enemies were no match for Chris's squad. At the same time, the cavalry unit, moving from the flank, also encountered significant enemy forces. The problem was that the enemies were significantly outnumbered. Their numerical superiority was making itself felt. But just at that moment, as if on cue, Klein appeared, ready for battle and brimming with confidence. Thanks to his extensive training with Tekkel, he had become many times stronger, surpassing his former self by a factor of 10. And now, single-handedly and without hesitation, he was dispatching a whole horde of enemy fighters, not retreating a single step. Nevertheless, there were still too many opponents. The stream of enemies seemed endless. Fortunately, Chris's squad arrived just in time at the most crucial moment and joined the fight without delay. They were ready to tear literally every enemy to shreds, so fierce were their attacks. These warriors were on a whole different level, experienced, hardened, incredibly strong. However, the enemy had an advantage. They used fast horses with bright red manes, which provided mobility. To avoid being trapped and surrounded, Chris's squad formed a strategically planned double line. The protagonist, despite everything, was firmly confident in his abilities. He had no intention of losing. The very next day, alarming news reached the 8 Gates base. Their reconnaissance unit had been completely wiped out, and it was none other than that very young man with dark blue hair, who had already become a legend, who did it. After the victorious battle, Chris gathered all his soldiers to discuss their next steps. He told the squad about the horses with red manes. They are significantly faster and stronger than ordinary animals, but they have a nasty, stubborn temperament. However, if you give them a bee flower, the horse will become obedient. Although the hero had dealt with the main body of the enemy forces were still numerous and dangerous. The attack must be sudden, coming from an unexpected direction, but that requires a plan. For now, it's best to head back. Night is the perfect time for a surprise attack. It will conceal their movements and slow the enemy's reaction. It was decided. Chris's squad would split up to operate covertly and effectively. They would have to move very quietly, without making a single unnecessary sound, like shadows in the darkness. Judging by the differences in clothing and the officers' epaulets, the commander of the enemy camp was standing before them. If Lin could kill him right now, real chaos and confusion would break out in the enemy camp. And now Lin's arrow, released precisely and silently, hits the target dead on, leaving it no chance at all. At that very moment, Chris's troops, who had been lying in wait in the bushes, came out and launched a lightning-fast assault. Meanwhile, the remaining fighters from the protagonist squad took their positions and acted according to plan. Their task was to distract the 8 Gates reconnaissance unit and confuse the enemy. After the coordinated attack, the enemy base was completely destroyed, reduced to ashes, with no chance of recovery. Chris, along with Lind, Dingo, and Daki, rushed to the aid of the remnants of the squad still fighting. The enemy reconnaissance squad found itself surrounded on all sides and trapped in a hopeless situation. The enemies were quite strong and resilient, well-armed, and had no intention of surrendering. But Chris's fighters were far stronger. Their fighting spirit and skills far surpassed the enemies. In the end, the enemy's main reconnaissance unit was completely destroyed and wiped off the map. As a reward for the victory, the protagonist asked the command for another 300 agile cavalrymen. By that point, the 8 Gates had finally learned of the complete annihilation of their main reconnaissance unit. There was no time to delay. Now they had to launch a direct, head-on assault. Both sides finally gathered all their main forces. A massive battle was taking shape. A real, full-scale war had begun. Merciless, uncompromising, with the goal of total annihilation. The intensity of the fighting rose sharply. The enemy threw its most elite and battle-hardened troops into the fray. Meanwhile, Chris's unit launched an attack from the rear, hoping to catch the enemy off guard. But this time, the enemy was ready. They had anticipated this move and prepared a countermaneuver. Enemy soldiers also moved to the rear, and now the protagonist and his squad found themselves completely surrounded. The situation was getting worse. Chris's soldiers were beginning to lose ground and were retreating under pressure. A difficult decision had to be made: to retreat immediately before the situation became catastrophic. With the help of Dingo and Doka, the protagonist began clearing a path for the retreat, holding back the enemy's advance. Meanwhile, Count Ludwig's main forces launched a full-scale assault on the enemy positions. Chris's squad managed with great difficulty to break out of the encirclement, though they were pursued by 100 elite fighters. Fleeing from their pursuers, the hero's soldiers threw smoke grenades at their feet, hiding in the smoke screen. Thanks to this ruse, the squad managed to confuse their pursuers and gain a few precious minutes. However, Chris himself stayed behind. He decided to fight the remaining enemies alone. Thanks to his mastery of the art of Vey, he had gained one crucial ability. He can sense and even see the enemy, despite the thick, impenetrable fog shrouding the battlefield. Chris didn't choose this spot by chance. With the hill on both sides, escaping from here would be extremely difficult. Slowly, coolly, and precisely, he cut down his enemies one by one, like a shadow come for their souls. From now on, these soldiers would know only one feeling: a terrifying, paralyzing fear of an unknown nightmare. This soldier turned out to be the last one in this sector. The squad had been completely wiped out. Now it was time to deal with their commander, the true source of this entire threat, and he turned out to be no pushover. You can't just take on an enemy like that. You'll have to work hard. But the protagonist still has a few tricks up his sleeve, moves that no one knows about. A few enemy soldiers still manage to break out and try to escape, but they're caught by Chris, Doka, and Dingo's squad, who mercilessly finish off the fugitives. And now Chris himself emerges from the building, victorious, unscathed, as if the day had only just begun. There's no one left inside. He single-handedly killed all the enemies, like a demon in human form. All that's left is to tidy up his gear, catch his breath, and get back to the battle as quickly as possible. 2 days passed, and it became known Count Ludwig's nightly squad had broken through the enemy camp, though not without suffering losses. And Chris himself, now in the enemy's ranks, is called the Devil of Black Smoke, a name that strikes terror into the hearts of all. The hero hurried back to the city of Debid. He has a crucial message that must be delivered immediately. Thanks to his experience from his past life, Chris knows that enemy forces are lurking nearby. Although the course of history has changed slightly, this event must still happen. An enemy attack is inevitable. The enemies will grow bold and go straight for the king, ignoring the front lines and attacking from the unexpected rear. But things turned out to be even worse. The enemy troops had already arrived. They came much earlier than expected. Chris was caught off guard. It all happened too quickly. There was no time to prepare. There are no more than 200 soldiers in the city right now, far too few to defend it. But the enemies didn't attack right away. Instead, they began beating their drums, sending some kind of mysterious signal. What does this mean? This is clearly not a routine threat. There's something more behind it. It turned out that enemy spies and assassins were hiding among his own soldiers, an internal threat. That drum signal was the command to launch an attack on the fortress commander himself. Fortunately, Chris was right there at the right moment. He blocked the fatal blow just in time. This attacker was no ordinary man. His movements were as polished as those of a true master. He was definitely a professional assassin, trained specifically for such covert operations. Despite this, together with the other fighters, Chris managed to neutralize him and prevent him from escaping. It turned out that the enemies hadn't come to storm the compound, but with a single goal: to kill the commander. But since the assassin didn't give the signal, their plan failed, and now the enemies are considering a new strategy. One of those who, according to Chris's memory, breached Sunset Hide in the past, a young warrior named Wise from the Eight Gates, is Perth. By all indications, he'll arrive tomorrow, and he's not someone to mess with. And the next day, the enemies were indeed there. They approached right up to the walls. Their main army was already in position. Chris and his squad went out to meet them to negotiate and ascertain their intentions. He made a proposal: a duel. If they lost, the fortress would surrender without a single drop of blood being shed. These soldiers had come from the City of Wolves. They valued military honor, and the hero intended to use that to his advantage. They simply cannot refuse such a proposal. It is their code of honor. The first to challenge him to a duel was a young squire named Nafthal, passionate and ambitious. His opponent was Dingo, silent, swift, and deadly. With a single lightning-fast strike, he split the enemy squire in two, a stunning display of power. These fighters are truly strong, but Chris's squad is on another level, in a completely different class. Next to step forward was the Centurion commander, a warrior named Foch, already far more experienced. But even he couldn't put up serious resistance. Dingo dealt with him just as easily, and so it continued with each successive one. The enemy lost their commanders one after another. Dingo single-handedly defeated 5 commanders in a row without receiving a single scratch. Now Lin takes over in the duels, a skilled archer, but he's no stranger to the sword either. Although he is known as an archer, he fights with a sword no worse than any knight. And here, once again, he had no equal. His opponents fell one after another. But now the enemy is starting to field truly strong fighters. Things are getting serious. The next opponent in the duel is a knight from Wolves named Pen, formidable and commanding respect. Daki steps forward to face him, unruly, always bold, and unpredictable. This knight really was strong. His strikes were precise, and his defense was flawless. He wounded Daki, and that was a mistake. Now Daki is enraged and thirsts for revenge. It was a mistake to anger Daki. No one should have done that, not even a fighter like him. He was furious to the point of madness. Now his strikes have become even more ruthless and unstoppable. If things continue in this vein, Chris's plan might work perfectly. The enemy commander is already considering calling in Pert, their strongest fighter. But the challenge is accepted by another, the commander of the Wolves unit, an elite soldier named Radon Wolves. And now it's the protagonist's turn to step into the arena for this decisive duel. But no, it's not Perth. Although Chris is certain, he's here, watching, waiting for his moment. And there he is, the man who destroyed Sunset Hyde, the legend of the battle. First, he has to deal with Radon, and only then will Chris face off against Pert. In battle, Radon attacks sharply but constantly shields himself. He's got plenty of experience. Well, let him try to block the next strike. A powerful one aimed with precision. Radon managed to parry even Chris's move. Snake-tongued. He clearly underestimated his enemy. Now Chris is changing tactics. He can't waste any more time. He recalls the dance Tekkel once taught him, a technique of the ancient masters. A melody plays in his head, and the spear now feels weightless. It becomes an extension of his arm. Chris's strikes became lightning fast, elusive, and unceasing, like the rhythm of a raging torrent. Radon couldn't fend off this wave of attacks. His defense cracked. Chris emerges victorious. He has defeated yet another powerful enemy on this path. Now it is time for the real duel. The battle against the legend. Whoever wins will determine the fate of this entire bloody battle. Commander Alec Wolves agrees. If Perth loses, Wolves' army will retreat. The duel begins. The wind dies down. Everyone freezes in anticipation. In an instant, Perth is right next to Chris. His reaction is simply unreal. He strikes. Chris barely manages to block it. Perth doesn't wait. A series of lightning-fast, precise attacks follows. He's incredible. Strong, fast, and coldly calculating. He has reached the third level of Vase and possesses the double ability, doubling his strength. Even Chris is struggling under such pressure. He's barely holding on. But the hero doesn't give up. This is only the beginning. He's feeling out his advantage. Chris changes his stance and launches a counterattack, restrained but precise. Perth immediately reads his movements. His intellect is astonishing. Even Tequila's technique doesn't yield the desired result. The enemy is too strong. But Chris has one last trump card, a deadly rhythm that works only once. It is the dance of death, its rhythm like a funeral march playing in his head. Even then, Pert manages to knock the spear out of Chris's hands. Incredible skill. But the dance has already begun. The hero cannot stop. He moves by the inertia of his soul. And now, a vulnerability opens up in Pert, barely noticeable. But it's there. A sharp, powerful knee strike. Pert is knocked off his feet. And then, a piercing light, like the final chord in this symphony of death. Chris wins. He has won. He has done the impossible. Now the Wolves' army must retreat, but Chris decides to follow. The war isn't over. Even though he's wounded, he can't stop now. Meanwhile, the battle on the main front is still raging. Count Ludwig leads the charge in person. His sword still gleams on the battlefield. Guillen, his loyal knight, is also there, fighting to the last. But now the Wolves' forces appear. They surge forward like an avalanche. Because of this, the Count's army's morale plummets. The enemies gain the upper hand once more. But everything changes when Chris appears, like a light in the darkness. With his squad, he once again infiltrates the enemy's rear and delivers a crushing blow. It's too early to give up. The most important and exciting part is just beginning. Count Ludwig, fortunately, is alive, but the situation remains dire. Chris rushes to his aid. He must pull this man out of the heat of battle. Damn it! The arrow hit the horse right in the chest. Damn it! The arrow struck the Count's horse. The animal collapsed, kicking up clouds of dust. And in that very moment, an enemy sword pierces the Count's body, right through, leaving him no chance. Is this really the end for Van Ludwig, defender of the crown and the walls? No, it's not over yet, because Chris is already here, and he's not too late. With a single lightning-fast strike, he beheads the enemy commander. And how ironic, neither his son nor even Guillen is by the dying Count's side. All for the sake of this wall, which he has guarded his entire life. All for the sake of the kingdom. With these words, the great Van Ludwig dies right on the battlefield, like a true knight. But the battle is not over. The commander's death does not mean the end of the war. The battle rages on. And as long as the enemies are alive, the fight is not over. Whoever is tired of life, let them face Chris one-on-one. He warned you. Whoever takes the risk will get what's coming to them. Enemies must be crushed while they're still moving, without mercy, without pause. Another knight of the Eight Gates appears on the field. Pedro, a renowned master of combat. But even he couldn't hold out. A single blow from Chris shatters his ribcage. What? Is that all? Is that really your limit, Knight? Is there anyone here who can even come close to Chris's strength? Everyone wants glory. Everyone wants to be the one to defeat him. Well, go ahead and try. Right now, there's no one on this field who can match him. He's like a fighter jet in human form. The rear is secured. The enemies have been pushed back. All that's left is to hold out and finish them off. These fighters are the last hope for victory in this hell. The 8 gates are retreating again. Another humiliating defeat. After a bloody battle, the fallen Count's son, Vihane Ludwig, takes his place. He must, at all costs, make Squire Chris his vassal. But Chris is in no hurry. He heads to Daybeta prison for a personal reason. There he finds that very assassin, the one who voluntarily allowed herself to be captured that day. He clearly realized that he was facing not just an ordinary killer, but a cold-blooded and experienced professional, and therefore she would never have allowed herself to be taken captive so easily and without a fight. The girl unexpectedly shared with him a strange dream in which a mysterious seer appeared to her, as if from another world, bearing an inescapable message. The mysterious seer told her a prophecy. Very soon she would encounter a dark blue flame, and it would be the cause of her certain doom. That day, the mercenary finally realized that the words of this mysterious vision referred to none other than Chris, for everything in the prophecy pointed specifically to him. She also mentioned that the seer had added, a fire with dark blue hair and eyes the color of molten gold would soar to the summit after a battle with the Sword of Night. Although this girl looked quite sweet, and her words were full of sincerity, it would be extremely rash to trust her completely just yet. When the time was right, he would send someone to free her. But until then, she would have to be patient and wait. At that very moment, a high-ranking guest arrived in the city. Count Faiz Elegwan, the authorized representative of the royal court itself. His visit was timed to personally award and honor the heroes who had distinguished themselves in the recent brutal and bloody battle. In addition, the Count informed Ludwig that Squire Chris had officially... When Ludwig entered the tent to speak with Chris, he was greatly surprised to find that Elegwan was already there, engaged in a casual conversation with the hero. Count Elegwan sat confidently, as if at home, and discussed with Chris something important related to the latter's fate and future events. By personal order of the third prince, the Count conveyed the instruction to immediately escort Squire Chris to the palace. Moreover, Count Elegwan had far-reaching plans. He wanted to introduce Chris to his daughter, hoping for a politically advantageous alliance. But the hero, drawing on the painful experiences of his past life, understood the moment was approaching when he would have to say goodbye to these lands forever. He knew it was time to leave. The moment had come to abandon everything he had managed to build here and move on toward a new, more dangerous destiny. This young man had indeed managed to single-handedly defeat 100 battle-hardened enemy soldiers, earning universal respect and fear. However, before leaving these lands, the protagonist decided to test his strength one last time by engaging in a duel with his longtime rival, Gillian. This was to be the decisive battle, the final clash that would determine how far he had come on his path as a warrior. This time, Chris was certain he had become significantly stronger, and now a fire burned within him that had been absent in previous battles. The guy had truly changed. Whereas before he would lose consciousness just from the presence of a deadly aura, now he stood his ground with confidence. This time, he wasn't going to back down. He was ready for a real battle, for a clash that would determine who he had truly become.